Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day
11
in our journey into the first letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. I wonder how many of you who are watching are acquainted with the Comrades Marathon here in South Africa. It's a race that's run between two cities, Pietermaritzburg, which is in a sense the capital of Natal, right in the Midlands, and then a harbour city called Durban, approximately 90 kilometers apart. That is how far the race is. Now, every year they have plus minus between 12 and 15,000 people that get together on a Pacific day to run the race. And the only thing that you have to run against is not one another, but against time. You have to be at the end, the finish, within 11 hours. Now, Paul, in his final verses in chapter 9, brings out one of the most important qualities that a Christian needs in his journey here on planet Earth, and that is this need of self-discipline. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, which is our chapter of study today, Paul draws our attention to the life of the Israelites in the wilderness. Now, he mentions something there that is quite interesting. He refers to them as our ancestors. Then he makes this comment, and this is all found in verse 1. They were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. Interesting observation. Under the cloud, which means they were under God's presence. God's presence was always shrouded within the cloud. And he mentions that they all went or passed through the sea. That was on their journey from Egypt, from the land of slavery towards the promised land. And then he says in verse 2, and they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Paul makes a very important statement here. What he is saying is that the way in which the people within the Old Testament were saved is identical to the requisites or the prerequisites made of those living within the New Testament. Paul is basically saying there is only one gospel message. There isn't a gospel message to the people in the Old Testament who were perhaps seen as people under the law and having to comply with conditions of the law. And all of a sudden, in the New Testament, we find ourselves under this aspect of grace. Paul makes it very clear that the same God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament, and that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament have one thing in common, and that is that they had one common plan of salvation. I want you to also notice that there's a lot of people who are Christian that feel that they are living in different dispensations of time, and because of that, the plan of salvation needs to be adapted to the time that we find ourselves in. No, dear friends, the plan of salvation is the same as it was there to our parents and what was offered to them in the Garden of Eden, and it'll be the same plan until Jesus comes in the clouds of heaven to fetch us. Paul makes it very clear that he preached this gospel message, and that should anyone, this is found in Galatians chapter 1, should anyone come and introduce to you a plan of salvation, a gospel other than the one that was given to Paul by Jesus Christ, he says, may that person be accursed. So here, in some sense, in the beginning of chapter 10, Paul draws our attention that the people in the Old Testament, the Israelites, were under the same conditions of the plan of salvation as we find ourselves. But then it's also interesting that he says in verse 3, they all ate from the same spiritual food. That means the same food is what we eating from. And they drank the same spiritual drink. And then he goes on to say what that is. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them. And then he makes it very clear who it was that was accompanying them. there in the Old Testament, in the cloud, and who provided the water. He says, and that rock was Christ. The last part of verse 4. But then he goes on to say something, and this word, nevertheless, is a verse or a word that constantly catches my attention. He says, nevertheless, even though they had been given the same wonderful plan of mercy, this plan of grace, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, we are counseled quite clearly that God for 40 years tested the people in the wilderness to find out what was going on in their hearts, whether they loved Him and would keep His commandments. And dear friends, that test is still the test today. That test will stand the test of time. So I want you to then notice that he says in verse 6, and he again draws our attention to it in verse 11. He says, now these things occurred, these things that happened to the Israelites, occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. So Paul was saying, as God tested them and they hardened their hearts against God, they remained in the wilderness. He goes on to say in verse 11, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the age has come. Paul says we are living in the last heartbeats, and this requirement of God, this test of God, is still being issued, and we are to take it seriously. It is a matter of ending up in the promised land, or it's a matter of remaining in the wilderness. So he then says something that's very powerful, and it's a statement that I think we need to really consider no matter what stage we find ourselves in our spiritual experience. But he says in verse 12, so if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Just as Paul was saying, those people in the wilderness felt that they were Abraham's descendants and entitled to things. He says, if you think that you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. There's an old saying, pride always precedes a fall. Then he says in verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. This is quite comforting to me, that whatever I find or challenge I find myself in, dear friends, it's not just a unique challenge to me. In actual fact, it's a challenge that all of the people on planet Earth have to go through, even God's children. But God's children have this one beautiful understanding, and that is what we find in verse 13. No temptation, God will allow no temptation to overtake you except what is common to mankind. That means it's not going to be some kind of unique experience. And so in some sense, if we look at the people in the past, from their experiences, we should be able to draw a understanding of how we should approach. We should look at those who were victorious for Christ and copy them. He then says, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. Isn't that wonderful? That when He allows us to go through these trials, they will be trials that have especially adapted for us in our journey, in our growth, in our spiritual experience. And then he says there, not only will He make sure that you're not tempted beyond what you can, but that when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So what Paul is saying here, when you find yourselves in those challenging moments, first of all, remember that this is a common challenge to all mankind, and that God will never allow you to be tested beyond your ability to resist. But if you find yourself in that point of temptation, He says what you need to do is go on your knees, Ask God for counsel. And as he says there, he will provide you a way out so that you can stand up in that time of trial. So your assurance or your victory lies in whom you ally yourself with, who you listen to, and do whatever he says, whatever the word of the Lord tells you to do. My counsel to you is follow that word. Be obedient to that word. And then, of course, Paul goes on to relate how that sometimes people, and this is again touching the point, that you can't blend evil and good. You see, in the time of the people in Corinth, they used to have feasts in the temples that they used to serve as Gentiles. And these were very important feasts. But when these Gentiles became a Christian, some of them brought their teachings or their experiences into the church. It was known as proselytes, people who were not believers but were made followers of Christ. Sometimes they would bring certain clutter with them into the church. And one of these things that was brought in was this aspect where they influenced the Lord's Supper. Remember, Christ replaced the Passover feast with the institution of the Lord's Supper, that feast that he introduced there just before he went to the Garden of Eden. Not the Garden of Eden, Garden of Gethsemane. And we were counseled, or Christ counsels us in that moment, that we are to always commemorate his death and his victory in the communion service. But part of this whole communion service, or the Lord's Supper, had been tarnished by certain teachings that had been brought in. And it was regarding if the meat had been offered to idols and things like that. And Paul just says that we need to be very careful. That he says in verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. So what Paul is really saying here very clearly, dear friends, you can't serve the devil and you can't serve God. You either have to be totally committed to God, otherwise you're still under the control of the devil. So he touches an aspect here and mentions that anything that is introduced into the church function that is not found in his word, that is not counseled in his word, in actual fact comes from demon worship, and we should not be a part of that. Of course, he ends off with one of the most beautiful things that we as God's children have, and that is that we are not compelled to do anything. We are not forced to do anything. In actual fact, we have perfect freedom. And he kind of uses this to tell us that when we belong to God's kingdom, we will belong to that kingdom because we have chosen it, not because we've been forced to do it. Whereas any other religion, in some sense, places a force on you. So he makes it very clear that everything in this earth belongs to God. He can do with it as he pleases. But what is important, he says, and this I want to draw to your attention in closing. Paul makes a comment here that sometimes people will come, and what the Spirit of God had influenced them as to what they should do, they would almost impose on others. And Paul says, no, that is not what we are to do. The only law that we fall under is not man's law, but under God's law. And that while we have the Spirit of God, we should be very careful to listen to that voice. And he refers to it as conscience. He says, this is verse 29, I am referring to other person's conscience, not yours. When other people tell you this is what I think you need to do, or this is what I'm doing, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it. Whatever the Spirit of God teaches you in accordance with Scripture, if it complies with Scripture, that is what you should be doing. So finally, Paul says, and these are the most famous words read many times, verse 31, so whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So again, he's saying that sometimes, even if it's a matter where you have to just walk with a person a second mile, do it in order to keep the peace, but do it because we are peacemakers. And as a result, we will be vindicating God's beautiful plan of salvation. So it's an incredible chapter, a chapter again that I've enjoyed reading many times, especially when I feel challenged by the devil. Have a wonderful day. The Lord bless you. Speak to you soon again. Bye-bye.